Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Glad you're back with me today. And we're going to continue reading in our book Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Well, the last 2 days we've read about them harvesting their crops, the early harvest and the later harvest. Well, that's all done now. They got it done in the nick of time before the big frost. So now they get to do something fun. They're going to be at the county fair. Have you ever been to a fair or a carnival? Well, let's see what it was like back then. Early in the frosty morning, they all set out for the fair. All of them were dressed up in their Sunday clothes except for her mother. She wore her second best dress and took an apron, for she was going to help with the church dinner. Under the back buggy seat was a box of jellies and pickles and preserves that Eliza Jane and Alice had made to show at the fair. So it was kind of a competition, and at our fairs they do the same thing. People bring special things that they've made. It could be those same type of canned goods, home canned goods, or maybe pies or cakes. They also like to bring their animals so that they could see who has the best animal that year. Also, another thing they bring lots of times is different crops. Like they might bring their best ears of corn, or they might bring their peas. One time my brother entered potatoes that I had grown. Well, let's read about it. Alice was taking her wool work embroidery too, but Amonzo's milk-fed pumpkin had gone the day before. Oh, that's what he's taking. It was too big to go in the buggy. Amonzo had polished it carefully, and Father had lifted it into the wagon and rolled it into a soft pile of hay, and they had taken it to the fairgrounds and given it to Mr. Paddock. Mr. Paddock was in charge of such things. This morning the roads were lively with people driving to the fair, and in Malone the crowds were thicker than they had been even on Independence Day. All around the fairgrounds were acres of wagons and buggies, and people were clustered like flies. Flags were flying and the band was playing. Mother and Royal and the girls got out of the buggy at the fairgrounds, but Amonzo rode on with Father to the church sleds, and he helped unhitch the horses. The sheds were full, and all along the sidewalks, streams of people in their best clothes were walking to the fair while buggies dashed up and down the streets in clouds of dust. "Well, son," Father asked him, "what shall we do first?" "I want to see the horses," Amonzo said. So Father said they would go look at the horses first. The sun was high now, and the day was clear and pleasantly warm. Streams of people were pouring into the fairgrounds, and a great noise of talking and walking, and the band was playing gaily. Buggies were coming and going. Men stopped to speak to Father, and boys were everywhere. Frank went by with some of the town boys, and Amonzo saw Miles Lewis and Aaron Webb, but he stayed with Father. They went slowly past the tall back of the grandstand and past the low, long church building. This was not the church, but a church kitchen and dining room at the fairgrounds. A noise of dishes and rattling pans and a clatter of women's voices came out of it. Mother and the girls were inside it somewhere. Beyond it were rows of stands and booths and tents, all gay with flags and colored pictures and men shouting. Step this way, only 10 cents, 1 dime, the 1/10 of a dollar, oranges, sweet Florida oranges, cures all ills of man and beast, Prizes for all, prizes for all. Last call, boys, put down your money. Step back, don't crowd. One stand was a forest of striped black and white canes. If you could throw a ring over a cane, the man would give it to you. There were piles of oranges and trays of gingerbread, tubs of pink lemonade. There was a man in a tailcoat and a tall shining hat who put a pea under a shell and then paid money to any man who could tell him where the pea was. I know where it is, Father, Almanzo said. Be you sure? Father asked. Yes, said Almanzo, pointing. Under that one. See, there were a bunch of shelves, and they would move them all over to confuse you. Well, son, we'll wait and see, Father said. Just then a man pushed through the crowd and laid down a $5 bill beside the shells. There were 3 shells. The man pointed to the same shell that Almanzo had pointed at. The man in the tall hat picked up the shell. There was no pea under it. The next instant, the $5 bill was in the tailcoat pocket, and he was showing the pea again and putting it under another shell. Almanzo couldn't understand it. He had seen the pea under that shell, and then it wasn't there. He asked Father how the man had done it. I don't know, Father said, but he knows it's his game. Never bet your money on another man's game. They went to the stock sheds. The ground there was trodden into a deep crust of dust by the crowds of men and boys. It was quiet there. Almanzo and Father looked for a long time at the beautiful bay and brown and chestnut Morgan horses with their flat, slender legs and small, neat feet. The Morgans tossed their small heads and their eyes were soft and bright. Almanzo looked at them all carefully, and not one was better than the horses, a better horse than the colts Father had sold last fall. Then he and Father looked at some thoroughbreds with their longer bodies and thinner necks and slim haunches. The thoroughbreds were nervous. Their ears quivered, and their eyes showed the whites. They looked faster than the Morgans, but not so steady. Beyond them were 3 large speckled gray horses. Their haunches were round and hard, their necks were thick, and their legs were heavy. Long bushy hair hid their big feet. Their heads were massive. Their eyes were quiet and kind. Almanzo had never seen anything like them. Father said they were Belgians. They came from a country called Belgium in Europe. Belgium was next to France, and the French had brought such horses in ships to Canada. Now Belgium horses were coming from Canada into the United States. Father admired them very much and said, "Look at that muscle. They'd pull a barn if they were hitched to it." Almanzo asked him, "What's the good of a horse that can pull a barn?" "We don't want to pull a barn. A Morgan has muscle enough to pull a wagon, and he's fast too. Fast enough to pull a buggy." "You're right, son," Father said. He looked regretfully at the big horses and shook his head. "It would be a waste to feed all that muscle. And we've got no use for it. You're right." Almanzo felt important and grown up talking horses with Father. Beyond the Belgians, a crowd of men and boys was so thick around a stall that not even Father could see what was in it. Almanzo left Father and wiggled and squeezed between the legs until he came to the bars of the stall. Inside it were 2 black creatures. He'd never seen anything like them. They were something like a horse, but they were not horses. Their tails were bare, with only a bunch of hair at the tip. Their short, bristly manes, that's the, from their head, the hair that goes down, stood up straight and stiff. Their ears looked like rabbit ears. Those long ears stood above the long, gaunt faces, and while Almanzo stared, one of those creatures pointed its ears at him and stretched out its neck close to Almanzo's bulging eyes, its nose wrinkled and its lips curled back from long yellow teeth. Almanzo couldn't even move. Slowly the creature opened its long, fanged mouth, and out of its throat came a squawking roar. Yee-haw! Yee-haw! Almanzo yelled, and he turned and butted and clawed and fought through the crowd towards Father. The next thing he knew, he'd reached Father, and everyone was laughing at him. Only Father did not laugh. "It's only a half-breed horse, son," Father said. "The first mule you've ever saw. You're not the only one that was scared either," said Father, looking around the crowd. Almanzo felt better when he saw the colts. They were 2-year-olds and yearlings and some little colts with their mothers. Almanzo looked at them carefully and finally said, "Father, I wish—" "What, son?" Father asked. "Father, there's not a colt here that can hold a candle to Starlight. Couldn't you bring Starlight to the fair next year?" "Well, well," Father said, "we'll see about that when next year comes." Then they looked at the cattle. There were fawn-colored Guernseys and Jerseys that come from islands named Guernsey and Jersey near the coast of France. They looked at the bright red Devons and the gray Durhams that come from England. They looked at the young steers and the yearlings, and some were finer than Star and Bright. They looked at the sturdy, powerful yoke oxen. All the time, Almanzo was thinking that if only Father would bring Starlight to the fair, Starlight would surely take the prize. Then they looked at the big Chester white hogs, it's another name for a pig, and the smoother, smaller black Berkshire hogs. Almanzo's pig Lucy was a Chester white, but he decided that someday he would have a Berkshire too. They looked at the Merino sheep, like Father's, with their wrinkled skins and short, fine wool, and they looked at the larger Cotswold sheep, whose wool is longer but it's coarse. Father was satisfied with his Mirandos. He would rather raise less wool of finer quality for Mother to weave. By this time it was noon, and Almanzo had not seen his pumpkin yet. He was hungry, so they went to dinner. Remember, that's what we call lunch. The church dining room was already crowded. Every place at the long table was taken, and Elijah, Jade, and Alice were hurrying with the other girls who were bringing loaded plates from the kitchen. All the delicious smells made Almanzo's mouth water. Father went into the kitchen, and so did Almanzo. It was full of women, hurriedly slicing boiled hams and roasts of beef, and carving roast chicken, and dishing up vegetables. Mother opened the oven of a huge cook stove and took out a roasted turkey and ducks. 3 barrels stood by the wall, and the long iron pipes went from them into a cauldron of boiling water on the stove. Steam puffed from every crevice of the barrels, and clouds of steam came out. Almanzo looked into the barrel that was full of steaming potatoes in their clean brown skins. The skins broke when the air struck them and curled back from the mealy insides. All around Almanzo were cakes and pies of every kind, and he was so hungry he could have eaten them all, but he dared not even touch a crumb. At last he and Father got their places at the long table in the dining room. Everyone was merry, talking and laughing, but Almanzo simply ate. He ate ham and chicken and turkey and dressing and cranberry jelly. He ate potatoes and gravy, succotash, which is peas and corn, I think, baked beans and boiled beans and onions, and white bread and rye and Indian bread and sweet pickles and jams and preserves. Then he drew a long breath and he ate pie. When he began to eat pie, he wished he'd eaten nothing else. He had a piece of pumpkin pie and a piece of custard pie. Oh, that sounds so good. And he almost had a piece of vinegar pie. Now that I've never had. I wonder if it tastes kind of like lemon pie. He tried a piece of mince pie but could not finish it. He just couldn't do it. There were berry pies and cream pies and vinegar pies and raisin pies, but he could not eat any more. He was glad to sit down with Father in the grandstand. They watched the trotting horses flashing by, warming up for the races. Little puffs of dirt rose in the sunshine behind the fast sulkies. Royal was with the big boys down at the edge of the track, with the men betting on the races. Father said it was all right to bet on races if you wanted to. You get a run for your money, he said, but I would rather get something more substantial for mine. The grandstand filled up with people till it was packed all the tiers of the seats. The light sulkies were lined up in a row. I suppose that's some sort of wagon, or almost like a chariot. And the horses tossed their heads and pawed the ground, eager to start. Monzo was so excited he could hardly sit still. He picked the horse he thought would win, a slim, bright chestnut thoroughbred. Somebody shouted. All at once the horses were flying down the track. The crowd was roaring a yell. And Then suddenly someone was still in astonishment. An Indian was running down the track beside the sulkies. He was running as fast as the horses. Everybody began to shout, "He can't do it. $2, he'll keep up. The bay, come on, come on. $3 on the Indian. Watch that chestnut. Look at that Indian." And I'm going to show you the picture. I can't imagine a person being able to run anywhere near as fast as a horse. The dust was blowing on the other side of the track. The horses were flying, stretched out above the ground. All the crowd was up on the benches yelling. Almanzo yelled and yelled. Down the track, the horses came pounding. Come on, the bay. They flashed by too quickly to be seen. Behind came the Indian running easily. In front of the grandstand, he leaped high in the air, turning a handspring, and stood saluting all the people with his right hand. The grandstand shook with the noise of shouting and stomping, and even Father was shouting, "Hurrah, hurrah!" The Indian had run a mile in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, as fast as the winning horse. And he was not even panting. He saluted all the cheering people again and walked off the track. The bay horse had won. There were more races, but soon it was 3 o'clock, time to go home. Driving home was exciting that day because there was so much to talk about. Royal had thrown a ring over one of the black and white striped canes, and he had it. Alice had spent a nickel on a peppermint candy. She broke the striped stick in two, and each had a piece to suck slowly. It seemed strange to be at home, only long enough to do the chores and sleep. Early next morning, they were driving away again. There were 2 more days of the fair. This morning, Amanzo and Father went quickly past the stock sheds to the display of vegetables and grains. Amanzo caught sight of the pumpkins at once. They shone out brightly golden among all the duller things, and there was Amanzo's pumpkin, the largest of all. "Don't be too sure of getting the prize, son," Father said. "It isn't size that counts as much as quality." Amanzo tried to not care too much about the prize. He went away from the pumpkins with Father, though he couldn't help but look back at the pumpkins now and then. He saw fine potatoes and beets and turnips and rutabagas and onions. He fingered the brown plump kernels of wheat and the grooved pale oats, the Canadian peas and the navy beans and the speckled beans. He looked at ears of white corn and yellow corn and red and white and blue corn. Father pointed out how closely the kernels grew on the best ears, how they covered even the tip of the cob. People walked slowly up and down looking. There were always people looking at something, looking at the pumpkins too, and Amanzo wished they knew that his was the biggest. After dinner, they hurried to watch the judging. The crowds were larger now, and sometimes he had to leave Father and squirm between the people to see what the judges were doing. The 3 judges wore badges on their coats. They were solemn, and they talked together in low voices so that no one could hear what they said. They weighed the grains in their hands, and they looked at them closely. They chewed a few grains of wheat and of oats to see how they tasted. They opened the peas and beans, and they shelled off a few kernels from each ear of corn to make sure how long the kernels were. With their jackknives, they cut the onions in two, and the potatoes. They cut very thin slices of potatoes. They held them up to the light. The best part of the potato is next to the skin, and you can see how thick the best part is if you hold a very thin slice to the light and look through it. The thickest crowd pressed around the table where the judges were and watched without saying anything. There wasn't a sound. When at last the tall, thin judge with the chin whiskers took a snip of blue ribbon and a snip of red ribbon out of his pocket. The red ribbon was second prize. The blue ribbon was first prize. The judge put them on the vegetables that had won them, and the crowd breathed a long breath. Then everybody talked. Amanzo saw that people who didn't get any prize and the person who got the second prize all congratulated the winners. If his pumpkin didn't get a prize, he would have to do that. He didn't want to, but he guessed he must. That means you're a good sport. At last the judges came to the pumpkins. Amanzo tried to look as if he didn't care, but he felt hot all over. The judges had to wait until Mr. Paddock brought them a big, sharp butcher knife. The biggest judge took it and thrust it with all his might into the pumpkin. He bore down hard on the handle, cut a thick slice out. He held it up, and all the judges looked at the thick yellow flesh of the pumpkin. They looked at the thickness of the hard rind and at the little hollow where the seeds were. They cut tiny slices and they tasted them. Then the big judge cut another pumpkin. He had begun with the smallest. The crowd pressed tight against Amanzo. He had to open his mouth to get his breath. At last the judge opened Amanzo's big pumpkin. Amanzo felt dizzy. The inside of his pumpkin had a big hollow for seeds, but it was a big pumpkin. It had lots of seeds. His flesh was a little paler than the other pumpkins. Amanzo didn't know whether that made any difference or not. The judge tasted it. He could not tell from their faces how it tasted. Then they talked together for a long time. He could not hear what they said. The tall, thin judge shook his head, tugged his whiskers, cut a thin slice, from the yellow pumpkin and a thin slice from Almanzo's pumpkin and tasted them. He gave them to the big judge, and he tasted them. The fat judge said something, and they all smiled. Mr. Paddock leaned over the table and said, "Good afternoon, Wilder. You and the boy are taking in the sight, I see. Having a good time, Almanzo?" Almanzo could hardly speak, but he managed to say, "Yes, sir." The tall judge had taken the red ribbon and the blue ribbon out of his pocket. The fat judge took hold of his sleeve, and all the judges put their heads together. The tall judge turned around slowly. Soon he took a pin from his lapel, the part on your shirt up here, and stuck it through the blue ribbon. He was not very near Almanzo's big pumpkin. He was not near enough to reach it. He held out the blue ribbon above the other pumpkin. He leaned and stretched out his arms slowly, and he thrust the pin right into Almanzo's pumpkin. Father's hands clapped on Almanzo's shoulder. All at once, Almanzo could breathe, and he was tingling all over. Mr. Paddock was shaking his hand. All the judges were smiling. Ever so many people said, "Well, well, Wilder, so your boy got first prize." Mr. Webb said, "That's a fine pumpkin, Almanzo. Don't know if I've ever seen finer." Mr. Paddock said, "I never saw a pumpkin that beat it for size. How'd you raise such a big pumpkin, Almanzo?" And here they are. Suddenly, everything seemed big and very still. Almanzo felt cold and small and scared. He hadn't thought before that maybe it wasn't fair to get a prize for a milk-fed pumpkin. Maybe the prize was for raising pumpkins in the ordinary way. Maybe if he told them, they would take the prize away from him. They might think that he had tried to cheat. He looked at Father, but Father's face didn't tell him what to do. I kept hoeing it," he said. Then he knew he was telling a lie. Father was hearing him tell a lie. He looked up at Mr. Paddock and says, "I raised it on milk. It's a milk-fed pumpkin. Is that all right?" "Yes, that's all right," Mr. Paddock answered. Father laughed. "There's tricks in all trades, but ours, Paddock, and maybe a few tricks in farming and wagon making too, huh?" Then Almanzo knew how foolish he had been. Father knew about the pumpkin, and Father wouldn't cheat. Afterwards, he went walking with Father among the crowds. They saw the horses again, and the colt that won the prize was not so good as Starlight. Almanzo did hope that Father would bring Starlight to the fair next year. Then they watched the foot races and the jumping contests and the throwing contests. Malone boys were in them, but the farmer boys won almost every time. The Malone boys were the boys that lived in town. Almanzo kept remembering his prize pumpkin and feeling real good. Driving home that night, they all felt good. Alice's woolwork had won first prize. Elijah Jane had a red ribbon, and Alice had a blue ribbon for her jellies. Father said the Wilder family had done itself proud that day. There was another day at the fair, but it wasn't so much fun. Almanzo was tired of having a good time. What? Tired of having a good time? 3 days of it was just too much. It didn't seem right to be dressed up again and leaving the farm. He felt unsettled, as he did at housekeeping time. He was glad when the fair was over and everything could go back as usual. Wow, they got to go all 3 days of the fair. That would be a lot of fun. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story. This chapter was pretty long. It's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house, and out of your house, in the day and the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming, keep a story in your heart. Bye-bye.